Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar on Brexit and the Nordic countries. What does the British decision to withdraw from the European Union mean for the Nordic countries, individually and collectively as the Nordic region or Norden? And before we begin, just let me give you some quick practical information. So this seminar will be streamed, which means that it is available as we speak online on NUPI's YouTube channel, and it will also be available to watch later on. And second, I would just please ask you to note that on each side there is an emergency exit. I don't think there will be a situation where we'll have to leave, but it's nice to know where it is. Now, I think it's fair to say that the British government's decision to withdraw from the European Union in 2016 marks a watershed in the history of European integration. And while the long-term implications of Brexit remain uncertain, I think it is beyond question that Brexit has already altered the European political landscape. Historically, there has been a close and often explicit connection between the Nordic states and Britain's approach to the European integration process. And since Britain joined the European Economic Communities in 1973, many of the Nordic countries have identified with British positions inside the Union. They have seen Britain as an important no-nonsense voice, as Erna Solberg, our Prime Minister, once put it, on integration matters. And we are interested with this seminar to discuss what changes might we expect to see in the Nordic states' relations with the EU post-Brexit. What kind of bilateral relationships will they seek with Britain when this is all over? And how will they respond to the changing power dynamics inside the EU and between the EU members and non-members after Brexit? And we are particularly interested in also hearing more today about how Nordic cooperation fits into this whole picture. This seminar has been generously funded by the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. They have a Nordic countries project, and it's also linked to an ongoing project we have here at NUPI, which is called Nordic Responses to Geopolitical Changes, which is financed by the Nordic Council of Ministers. We will soon hear from our Swedish and Danish colleagues, but first, Elisabeth Bauer, head of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Office for the Baltic States and Nordic countries, will say a few words.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very much pleased to be in NUPI the first time, and we started, I think, to discuss projects together about 2 years ago, but it takes a bit of time to get to know each other, and especially representing a German foundation, it's interesting for us to get to know about what will happen in the Nordic countries after Brexit, because we all know, especially in Germany, that there's been special relations between Denmark and Sweden and Great Britain inside the EU, but as well regarding Brexit, what will be the result? It has to be looked at what relations we do have to Norway, because as Great Britain tries to have other regulations for them, as it has been done with Norway, so it will really be interesting for Norway what will come out. But I would like to give you some overview about what we are, who we are, because it's the first time that we are publicly over here. We are a German political foundation. It's a very special institutionalized form we have got in Germany, because the political foundations in Germany are not part of the parties, they're only linked to parties. So we are tax funded, and our job and our work is to work together with everyone, so that we are quite free in that. And the political foundations, especially as well Adenauer Foundation, we are divided in different departments. So inside Germany, we are looking after the political education, which has to do, even especially the reasons for our foundation system, has to do with our history. Without Second World War and National Socialism, it never would have been the political system we have got at the moment in the foundations. That there shouldn't be any information center in the government, so that everybody should have the possibility to inform from different political positions. That's why these landscape of foundations we have got. So we've got this political education in Germany. We have got the Department of International Relations, where I belong to, with the office, which is located in Riga, but looking after the NB8 format. And then we have got the big think tank department as well, and I do know that some of my colleagues have been to NUPI and to other think tanks in the north already. So that's the different jobs we just collecting in one institution. And due to that, especially as we are named after the first Chancellor of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, we especially are looking after what's going on in the European Union. And so it's quite easy for us to decide to have a project together on what is going on and what is meant for the Nordic countries regarding Brexit. And I think the results can be interesting not only to have an overview in the Nordics, but as well for European Union and especially for Germany and for German politicians. So thanks a lot for being together in this project, and I'll give you the floor back. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. We are very happy to have two excellent Nordic scholars with us here today to offer respectively a Danish and a Swedish perspective on the whole Brexit process. At a later event, maybe we could come back to having Finnish and Icelandic colleagues as well. They are, of course, also part of the Nordic countries. But today we decided to focus on the two insiders, so to speak. So we have two perspectives of the Nordic countries who are inside the EU. Our first speaker here today is Henrik Larsen, who is a Jean Monnet professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And some of his research areas are the role of theories in analysis of foreign policies, the EU as a normative power, Danish foreign policy and EU foreign policy, but also Brexit is one of your expertise areas. So Henrik will offer us a Danish perspective. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. And if I change that here, let's see. Okay, right. Yeah, I mean, the UK played a very important role for Denmark's decision to become a member of the EC, as it was many years ago, and together with Norway, by the way, and over the years, Denmark has followed the UK on very many major sort of understandings in the EU, not least related to institutional questions, supranationality or rather not supranationality. At the same time, Denmark has also worked very closely with the UK in terms of in the military sphere, going all the way back to, well, going far back in NATO, but also in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria now, and actually also in the Baltic States, where the Danish forces are working under British command. So on that background, it's really quite interesting to look at the Danish reaction to the Brexit process. You would, a priori, I think, expect the Danes to be fairly helpful to the British and to follow the British quite extensively. But is it really so? And if not, why not? Now, the first thing I'm going to do is something which hopefully won't be too dry and boring. I'm going to say that the basic Danish political discourses on the EU are sort of fundamentally instrumental, in the sense that the EU is looked at from the point of view of what's good for Denmark and Denmark's interest, and not so much because there's a common cultural base, as you find in as dominant views in Germany and France. And within that sort of general way of understanding things, there are two essential ways, or two ways. The first is what I call the essential cooperation discourse, where the EU is seen as an essential arena for cooperation for Denmark for large intervention reasons. There may be some losses of sovereignty, of autonomy, but that's not. And that might, but they might be. They're willing. It's okay to live with them, because in the big scheme of things, the EU is an essential arena for Denmark, and that's something that's well with us for a long time. During the Cold War period, as late as this week, the Danish Prime Minister said in a debate in Parliament that the most important for Denmark is to hang on to the EU and to contribute to the EU hanging together, which is very much along the lines of that way of thinking. And that's been the discourse that's, so to speak, framed Danish policy towards Europe also after the introduction of the four Danish exemptions in 1993, which may be, for some, be quite surprising sort of postulate, given that Denmark is often seen as the odd man out and the laggard and so on. But I argue that it's a different sort of logic that's been running day-to-day Danish policy towards the EU. The second discourse, and I heard to say that most political parties in the Danish parliament would adhere to that discourse, and certainly the various governments, but not all. So I turn to the interstate cooperation discourse, where the point is that the EU should take the form of normal interstate cooperation with no substantial abrogations of sovereignty. So the question when you see new measures being taken in the EU is always, does that cross that border? And the Danish exemptions are seen as a sort of way of marking that border. In that context, the UK is very much seen as a guarantee for that border, and has been seen as such. And the UK's departure is therefore a sad thing. And the idea is that Denmark has got to do as much as possible to help the UK in that process. Now, then about Danish policy, I think I'll say very briefly that during the British renegotiation, Denmark firmly supported the UK's demands, but all conditional on there not being any institutional changes in the EU. No more changes that would lead to Danish referenda. But so I'll focus on the period after the British referendum, and what you got in that period was that well, the Danish Prime Minister and the Danish government immediately declared that this is a sad day for Europe and for Denmark, but also said that it does not change Denmark's belonging to the EU. And really what it's about now is, at the EU level, to regain the confidence of citizens in European cooperation. This will require a tremendous effort. So the focus was very much on how you could sort of help the EU to get on in that difficult situation. Also, the government's first priority, as it says, was in the coming negotiations with the EU to further Danish interests, not least the interests of Danish citizens and Danish in the UK, and Danish trade. So the official Danish reactions emphasized Denmark's interest and the EU's interest, and not the status of the UK, which is somewhat interesting if you think about what I've started out by saying about the historical relationship between Denmark and the UK. Right. Since the negotiations started, the Danish government has stuck to what I've called the mantra, almost between the balance between rights and obligations, which is very strong in the EU's negotiation mandate, so that if the British wanted to get a special deal, it would have to respect the sort of general balance. So that, for example, if the British couldn't get free access to EU markets if they didn't allow the free movement of labour. But within that, it stressed as close a relationship between the EU and the UK as possible, and continued Danish-British links in the field of security. So in a way, Denmark has kept itself very firmly within the EU sort of two-step approach. First, sorting out the premises of the divorce, and afterwards going on to the actual negotiations about the future relationship. But within that, Denmark, together with I think Sweden and Finland, has very sort of pushed the negotiations, trying to finish the first sort of settlement of the divorce, so that you can get on to the actual substance in the future relationship, and that way helping the UK, but also thinking about the sort of importance of Danish interest in sort of sorting out that bilateral relationship. Also, in the EU's negotiation mandate of the 23rd of March, for the negotiations about the future relationship, there were some disagreements between the member states about how detailed that negotiation mandate should be. Denmark wanted that mandate to be, as general as possible, while still giving some bullet points that the British could relate to. And Denmark sees itself as that, as a sort of help to get the British on to negotiating with the EU and making it less difficult. So again, the logic of the relationship is very much that the EU is essential cooperation for Denmark. Denmark wants to stay as close as possible to the core of EU cooperation, and that sort of framed the response to the Brexit process. Now let me move on to the broader implications. First of all, what you've seen in Denmark, just like in most other European countries, is an increased support for EU membership. So that in itself is maybe not that unusual. What's interesting is that that can also be found on the right wing of the political spectrum. And before that's a very significant difference from the period before Brexit, before the British referendum, where voters on the right wing would, generally speaking, vote against membership, or at least in the polls. So that's the first implication. The second implication is that the future British position becomes an option in the Danish British debate on Europe. Generally speaking, the Danish political debate has been marked by a greater degree of skepticism towards the EU, but that's this is most clearly expressed in the Danish People's Party's stance. The Danish People's Party was actually for Remain, with the British sort of special deal that was negotiated by Cameron. But now the position is that the British, whatever comes out of the positions with the UK, will be something that would be a good subject for a Danish referendum. So the Danish might actually want to choose a British option. The Danish People's Party has not itself said whether it would support such a role, but has still stressed that that's going to be on the agenda. Interestingly, the Danish People's Party doesn't mention the Norwegian option, because you would think that would be a very clear option, something you could discuss. So you could sort of gather from that what's in the agenda is something which is a looser affiliation with the EU than the EEAS for Denmark. Right then, not surprisingly, a diminished position of the UK has already taken place and has in fact been going on for a number of years. And there's a tendency to stress how closely the Danes and the British have worked together, but particularly in the light of the quite sort of skeptical British attitudes the last many years. Germany and France have come to mean a lot more for Denmark. And it's interesting that in relation to the Danish Prime Minister's visits to various countries this week, the press release stresses that the relationship to Denmark and Germany is in a class of its own. You may say that's a new thing in the light of Brexit, but I would say that's something that's been coming for over a number of years. In fact, another reaction is that the sort of Danish Foreign Service has set up a whole firework of bilateral visits to a number of other European countries, the Czech Republic, Portugal, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Ireland, with the aim of getting new allies in that in the absence of the UK. Then at the end, something about Nordic cooperation in that context, well, the first thing to note is that interesting it is that as I mentioned, with the sort of that diplomatic activity to find new partners, as far as I can see, there have been no sort of visit to Nordic capitals, which in that and the kind of answer you get if you ask the Danish Foreign Service about this is that, well, that's because we know what the Nordic countries think already. and we meet in various fora already. That might be one explanation. Another explanation might be the sort of, I think, tendency for the Danes to think more in cost-benefit terms about Nordic cooperation that you would think you would find in other, maybe amongst other Nordic countries. In a broader context, the issue about Nordic cooperation, I think, is also linked up to another thing, which is that with Brexit, you are likely to see further institutional dynamism. What we may be seeing now in the development of the Franco-German relationship, I know that there's a lot of ifs in that, but still, and the latest with the PESCO development, we're going to see an institutional movement here, and it's quite clear that in that process, Denmark has some problems. The Danish Prime Minister stresses that this movement should be about concrete measures. That's the way forward. That's the way of keeping Europe together. That's the way of keeping the populations on. So anti-terror, protection of the borders, growth, that sort of things. But no, not things like combining the post of President of the Commission and the European and the President of the European Council, or to have transnational European lists. Not that sort of things. There's, at the moment, there's no basis for suggest that the Danish Danish exemptions will be lifted, even though that the Danish government would like that to happen. In that context, if you still have a basic understanding of the EU as a central thing, an essential cooperation for Denmark, to which Denmark wants to be as close as possible, there's quite clearly a problem here in the years to come. And in that context, where Denmark is, so to speak, hanging on to the EU and to the core, then it's difficult to see that Nordic structures would be of much help in that context. If anything, rather the opposite, at least not in terms of a more fundamental change here. Unless, of course, you see a fundamental change of the central role of the EU and Danish foreign policy, or the gap between what Denmark would like to do and what Denmark can do becomes so big that it has to look for other options. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik. That is a very good introduction to the discussion we're going to have afterwards as well. I'm sure there are many questions already popping into people's heads. Let us first continue with a Swedish perspective. We have Björn Fagersten here. He is a senior research fellow and director of the Euro program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He conducts research on European integration, on security policy, intelligence, international institutions, and political risk. But he also has current projects involving the geopolitical consequences of Brexit. And he has worked quite a bit on this in the Swedish context as well. So Björn, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you for having me here. I'll just raise this a little bit. Yes, I think I'm just going to start. It was interesting listening to my colleague here from Denmark, because I think there's lots of similarities between the Swedish view and the Danish view on Brexit. But surprisingly, perhaps not a lot of cooperation, given that we come from rather similar situations. To start with, I think Sweden is also a pretty transactional actor when it comes to European affairs. Slightly less so when it comes to Nordic integration. Then we are a little bit more ideational. But our stance on EU integration is rather transactional, in the sense that we stayed out for decades because we simply thought it was not in our interest. We didn't need to kind of save our societies after the Second World War. We were afraid actually that the EU integration would threaten our welfare model, our neutrality, and it wasn't until after the end of the Cold War that we changed. But not really as an effect of changing geopolitics, but more as an effect of our internal banking crisis. And we understood that we needed the kind of strength of more stronger bonds to the continent. So it was really an economic choice, and also a difference to Finland, which we talked about here, who joined the EU together with us, but from a very different perspective. For them, it was all about security policy. For us, it was about the economy, and our politicians promised us that it had nothing to do with security, and they still do sometimes. Which is awkward because, of course, it's all about security these days. So we are pretty transactional as well. And that's why some of this more cost-benefit analysis of Brexit also turns out to be negative for us. So I'm going to start to say something about Brexit, and then how we, from a Swedish perspective, try to deal with this, and then also something about a Nordic perspective. When it comes to the relationship with the UK, at least that is the perception in Sweden, that we have a lot to lose from Brexit. We enjoy close bilateral ties, and we've had for quite some time with the UK. But these ties have to a large extent been kind of incorporated within the EU framework. So we manage our UK relationship within the EU, and that will, of course, need to change pretty soon. And you could discuss this relationship or the kind of commonality of interest with the UK in terms of EU policy, EU politics, and EU polity. Starting with policy, we usually agree on issues such as the size of the budget, the substance of the budget, competition policy, free trade, generally the kind of the liberal stuff that we like in the north, which they also like in the UK, and we've been close partners in that. If we look at politics, how we pursue power within a European framework, also here the views is pretty much shared between the UK and Sweden, and between the other Nordics, I should add. We are very much in favor of intergovernmentalism as a general principle, and we also have, I mean, the UK has been inserting the kind of evidence-based policy making, consequence analysis. We feel that they kind of lack that in their own decision to Brexit, but at least they worked under those premises in the EU, and that is something that Sweden was very much in favor. And of course, a joint interest of keeping the Euro countries at bay and being some kind of watchdog over the Eurozone issues. And then finally, EU polity, which we also heard from Denmark. I think it goes very well for Sweden as well. We are kind of allergic to too much of symbolism, flags, hymns, etc. We want the European affair to be a pretty clean affair. Again, transactional, deliver benefits to us, not too much symbolism or kind of loftier policy. So we have a common views on policy, politics, and EU polity, and this we will lose now with the UK. We will lose an important ally, and I think this is especially painful for Sweden in two areas. And one is the common security and defense policy, and the other is in the Euro area. And if we start with the common security and defense policy, this is a sensitive area for Sweden. As I said, we joined from a kind of economic transactional perspective. The EU was not about security. So that's the way it's been portrayed. And it's a bit ironical because we spent a lot of time from a Swedish perspective to try to affect the security policy of Europe, making it more civil rather than military. And we've been participating in every mission, but we still have the view that this is not any kind of military cooperation. And the UK, but from different reasons, have been a partner in this kind of fight when they've been sitting there with their veto and we can hide behind them. We can't hide behind them anymore. And at first, when we heard about Brexit, we thought like, oh my God, within 2 years' time, we're going to lose our important ally. Actually, we lost our ally after 2 months because that's when the UK turned already in about September 2016 and said like, hey, you can do what you want. We're not going to interfere anymore. We're going to manage our Brexit, and you can have your headquarters or whatever you would like. And that kind of shocked the Swedes because it was a hard awakening for us, and we needed to reposition ourselves. The other area is, of course, the kind of acting as a watchdog for the Euro countries, so they don't cook up decisions among themselves, which they present to the ECOFIN and all the EU members. And this is something that UK invested a lot in. We did as well, and here we're losing an ally. And if you can so what to do? And you can use Alfred Hirschman's old typology of exit voice loyalty when you're not happy with how an organization provides for your interest. You can exit like the Brits. That's not an alternative for Sweden. Actually, support for EU membership is stronger today than before Brexit. About 65% in favor. So there will be no Swexit as a result. Then we have voice or loyalty. Should we be more loyal, which essentially means be more German from a Swedish perspective, or should we use voice? Should we take up the UK's kind of mantle and take up the fight while they left? Looking at these two areas I've discussed, I think looking at security policy, we are probably going to be very loyal, mainly because this is an area with high kind of political cost for being an obstructive partner. The UK could take that cost, Sweden couldn't. If France, if Germany, etc., is really serious about European defense cooperation, and they are, especially after terror attacks now on European soil, then the price for being a kind of a veto player in this field would be just too high for Sweden. And I think this is what you saw last year, or starting in 2016. Sweden started out after Brexit with kind of trying to be negative, stopping the new headquarter, which is not called a headquarter, but it's kind of a headquarter. We were pretty negative against PESCO, the new permanent structured cooperation in defense. But after a couple of months, we turned. It effectively when Angela Merkel visited Löfven and told him to turn. And we announced that we will be part of PESCO. We don't have anything against this new headquarters, and we really appreciate this new direction. So you will see Swedish loyalty in the field of security and defense. When it comes to the Eurozone, I think we probably might use a little bit more of voice. We might be more loyal there also, but combined with more voice. I think because the area is less sensitive, it's sensitive for the negotiating actors, but it's not publicly kind of politicized in the same way. So I think you could expect Sweden to put up more of a fight when it comes to the size of the budget and the specificities, how to manage the Eurozone and how to relate to the outs. So a little bit more of voice there. But in general, this losing Britain as an ally has forced Sweden to reconsider its position and to seek out new allies. We've heard that from Denmark. It's the same with Sweden. We are moving close to Germany. That's what we saw in PESCO and in some other areas. And I think Sweden is willing to go a long way to please Germany. I mean, we wouldn't buy their submarines, but we're willing to do other things. A bit too close. If you look, for example, at PESCO, the French, I don't know how, but the new EU defense cooperation, eventually it turned out to be very German in its design. Everyone is welcome. It's more of a political integration project than an actual military vehicle for cooperation. The French, on the other side, wanted a much more sharp instrument for interventions. And that would, to some extent, fit the Swedish narrative better, because we actually like to do crisis management within an EU framework. And it would have been perhaps more helpful to have a French PESCO, but we stayed very close to Germany. I think maybe that is indicative of Sweden's. From being very close to the UK, we now move directly and try to position ourselves very closely to Germany. We have the same kind of dilemma, I think, as Denmark, that we have an interest in a post-Brexit deal with the UK that allows for lots of interaction, and we would be okay with as close a position as you could imagine when it comes to security, trade, etc. But we also have a national interest in EU unity, and we had Theresa May in Stockholm the other week, and it was pretty clear that this is hard to balance, but we're trying to do it right now, and we're pretty happy to have, I think, a strong mandate from the EU side now, because then we don't have to put out our neck too much. Now, from a more Nordic dimension, what does this mean? Because I think Brexit has unleashed both kind of centripetal and centrifugal forces, which is kind of at play at the same time. I think we need to recognize that the Nordics are, well, first of all, we're very similar. I have a friend who's an historian, and he says like the kind of what brings us together is that if you scratch on the surface of a Nordic country, you'll find a free farmer. We're all countries built on free farmers for hundreds of years. That's what brings us together. That's why our societies are pretty similar, norms, etc. Apart from the free farmers, we're pretty different. If you look at kind of the main decisions characterizing a state today, how you defend yourself, how you trade, how you formulate your foreign policy, there is, you could say, a normal European way of doing this. You defend yourself with NATO, you manage your European affairs for the European Union, and you trade with the euro. It's the European way, or the German way, if you like. No Nordic country has kind of choose this standard normal way. Actually, looking only at Scandinavia, there's not two Scandinavian countries who choose the same combination of these factors. So we are as different as we could possibly be if you look at these key choices: how to defend yourself, how to trade, how to manage your diplomacy or policy. And I think if you're kind of a negative, you could say that Brexit is actually aggravating these differences. In a worst case scenario, Brexit will sharpen the difference between the EU and NATO, as UK will focus more, and probably perhaps with the US being even less supportive of EU than of NATO, you could see a sharpening distinction or less cooperation there if you're negative. But you also see a sharp alliance between the Euro area and the rest of the EU. So all these lines that are dividing the Nordics are being sharper, slightly thanks to Brexit, at least in a kind of negative scenario. But as we heard, we've also seen more cooperation among the Nordics. We are pretty similar when it comes to policy, free trade, etc. I guess one of the big challenges will be to find formats. The EU is quite difficult, but maybe in a looser Nordic alliance, maybe within the G20 in the future, or in a kind of other minilateral setting, we would be more effective, because it's quite difficult within the EU right now. I also think there is a risk from a Nordic perspective there is again this conflict, like yes, we have interests in common, but do we really have kind of a meta interest in a Europe that is managed by these regional or minilateral groupings? I mean, we can invest now in this new Hanseatic League, or go for Nordic cooperation, but then you see also the new kind of Habsburg group around Austria, or other regional groupings in Europe. Is that a way of European policy making that is really in our long-term interest? I think that's a difficult question that I know Sweden is working with a lot right now. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you both to take a seat up here, and we will move to the more informal section of the room. We will soon take a few questions. I just wanted to make some observations about what you said. I think it's very interesting to hear how similar in many ways, even though you both noted some of the country-specific differences in terms of your own countries. But I think in both Sweden and Denmark, I think it's fair to say from your presentations that one generally sort of regrets that Brexit happened. At the same time, that one takes a pragmatic approach to the fact that it did happen, and has sort of fell down on putting the EU first, so to speak. And secondly, also this point you both mentioned about looking for new allies, and the fact that especially maybe Germany is coming out as a key country in that respect. And then thirdly, also that both seems to be picking very carefully what kind of priority cases one is pursuing at the moment in the EU, and maybe letting some cases rest a little and then choose the most important. I wondered if I could challenge you both a bit on saying a few more words about this internal dynamics that within the EU that you both talked about in your presentation, and especially this issue of the balance within the EU now being moved maybe a bit away from the Northern European weight, with Britain out of the picture. One could say that Germany is not an obvious replacement for Britain as an ally inside the EU for the Nordic countries, given that Germany and Britain has not always seen eye to eye on many of the political questions. I was wondering if I could challenge you both to say a few words about how that will play out. Will there be different cases where Sweden and Denmark respectively will seek cooperation with Germany? Will that lead to other matters, so to speak, being put on the agenda, you think?
Like that. Excellent. Yes, I mean, on the one hand, I think there is a pretty good opportunity to find cooperation with Germany, because actually Germany is in need of partners. The Euro crisis kind of tarnished Germany's reputation in the south. The migration crisis tarnished its reputation in the east. So Germany is really on the lookout for friends. On the other hand, Germany has a unique role in Europe because it is the kind of consensus maker. it is up to Germany and Angela Merkel to produce a European consensus, and that's a big difference. That was never the UK's role. So they are in a negotiation setting. They're extremely different kind of players. So we will have to understand that while we can try to get closer to Germany, they will need to be closer to everyone else because it's their job in Europe today. But I think, and slightly ironically, I think the area where Sweden could really find cooperation with Germany is in the economic area, economic policy. I mean, we are very German in our views on the euro affairs, etc. The problem is that we're not in the euro, but otherwise this would be an excellent area. Of course, I mean the other irony of Swedish engagement is the kind of social pillar, which we are very much in favor of, and we're having this meeting in Gothenburg the other year. But on the other hand, we're not in the euro, so if anything happens with that field, it's probably going to be within the eurozone, so we won't be part of it. So there's a bit of a mismatch of platforms and interest when it comes to at least Swedish-German interest. But I think, as the case of security policy illustrated, we're willing to. I mean, we have an overarching interest of staying close to Germany that is sometimes more important than the actual output of cooperation, and I think this PESCO, for example, is a good illustration of that.
Okay, all right, okay, great. Yeah, actually, I don't think I could say it much better than Björn has already said it. I just want to add two things. I mean, it's quite clear that even though Denmark is not a member of the euro, then the question about expenses and expenses flowing from what might be agreed in the eurozone is something that strikes a chord in Copenhagen. So in that sense, Germany is very important in the economic field as well, even for in that way as a non-euro zone member. The other thing I want to stress, as I sort of mentioned, a key point of cooperation is that that Denmark cannot take part in the defense operations in the EU, partly for that reason, partly so due to the virtue of the issue itself. Denmark is very keen on civilian crisis management, and that's something that Germany is very much promoting as well. So there's a significant point of cooperation here.
Since we're here in Norway, I have to challenge you on one more point. I was actually wondering, you mentioned a bit about how the Swedish and Danish priorities has not really been to visit the Nordic capitals. One maybe has one's face towards Europe instead and the continental countries. But I was wondering still, because here in Norway we are very much interested, of course, in Britain's where it will end up in its future association model with the EU. And I was wondering if this has an equally strong place in the national debates in your countries. Is there any tendency to look towards, you know, the implications for Norway, for example, of Britain's future choice, or should we say Britain's future model?
The interesting thing about the public debate, I think, given how much wind is often given to the sort of Anglophile inclinations of Denmark, is how little that subject is dealt with in concrete terms. It's very much becoming a question of the sort of what some newspapers are called the circus in British politics. The sort of closest you get to that issue is the Danish People's Party's suggestion for a possible referendum on a British-style option. But again, I wouldn't say that that's a question that takes a day. And again, that's something that I mean, again, for a country that's often sort of called itself close to the UK in many ways, that's quite surprising.
Yeah, on the Norwegian solution, I think I mean we have a big interest. We had a discussion before about the interest of, for example, the British embassies in Europe now trying to manage this situation, and so I've also been on several kind of breakfast meetings with the British diplomats, and one thing we tell them is how much we need to pay to move cheese from Sweden to Norway. It's actually not it's not a cost-free solution, although we don't import too much cheese, I think, to the UK. But still, so there are barriers, and I don't know perhaps not for that reasons, but there are other reasons for them not to maybe embrace the Norwegian solution. But then there's another question which you also brought up, like will the future solution, whether it's a Norwegian or some kind of tailor-made solution, will that be attractive for our country? And I don't think, and you said it will be a point in for Denmark, it will be something to be discussed. It might be in Sweden as well, but really for the fringe parties, like maybe the Sweden Democrats or the left, depending a little bit on the what kind of solution Britain will get. But in general, it's not really an interest of Sweden, again, for this transactional view, because I think any kind of British solution will be seen as suboptimal when it comes to creating stability, especially for the economy, and that was the very reason why we joined. So no, we won't go in that direction, I think.
We have a few questions from the audience. My list is still open, so you can just give me a little sign while others are speaking and our presenters are responding. The first speaker the question on my list is Pernille Rieker from NUPI.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for very interesting presentations. You both mentioned that the UK is, of course, a close partner to both Denmark or has been close partner and still is, and probably will be in the future. And that's the same for Norway. But I wonder, and you said also, both of you, that now Germany is kind of the next choice to link up to Germany. But I wonder to what extent you view the relationship between Denmark, Sweden, and France, because I mean, as you said also, Björn, that now when it comes to security policy, Sweden is perhaps closer to the French perspective of kind of deepening the crisis response or crisis management capacity of the EU. So I just wonder to what extent, and also it's interesting now with the election of Macron that you see a change in the economic policy, a change in French perspective, and also looking very much to the Nordic region as a model. And so I just wonder if you is this kind of link up to Germany? Of course, this is important, and Germany and France cooperate close together. But I just wonder if there is a kind of this is just from traditional approaches that all the Nordic countries are closer to Germany. Yeah, I would like to hear your perspectives on that.
You would like to go first? Start?
Yeah, I can start. Yes, I mean it's something that we discuss a lot, or at least we are interested in European affairs. I think Swedes in general are slightly worried about this kind of restarted engine and what it will produce between Germany and France. As for now, I think we've kind of chosen Germany, both when it comes to economic issues and security policy. And my argument was that in the security field we would be perhaps even better served with a more French perspective. But when it comes to the economy and kind of governance, we are still very kind of German in our outlook, and I don't think that will change. But you actually see a lot of more Swedish-French cooperation, much more French presence today, ministers visiting and discussions, especially I think about digital issues, environment issues like that. But yeah, so it's unclear to me how it will play out, but we are slightly worried about this kind of tandem policy, probably. But I think if there will be a kind of a compromise between Germany and France, for example, in the area of migration, it would probably be in the interest of Sweden. Perhaps not that will create cleavages between East and West, perhaps, but it would be in the interest of Sweden. On other issues, the euro, it depends a little bit what they come up with, but on the eurozone, my guess will be that whatever they can unite around will be pretty symbolic. German control combined with French symbolic, a small little budget, a finance minister without power, and I think that's something Sweden could live with. As well, but it's something we're looking on with, slightly worried about this new tandem and what it will produce, but it's very unclear for us exactly what it will produce. So,
thanks very much. Yeah, well, again, very much along the same line. I mean, Denmark takes its cue from Berlin rather than from Paris. Having said that, maybe a noticeable sort of exception here, that after the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015, I think the French scaled up their attacks in Syria, in northern Iraq, and urged others, including the Danes, to do so. The Danes actually followed suit, if I remember correctly, which is interesting in this context, because usually the cues would come from elsewhere, further north than Paris, for example. The second thing is that it's true that in Copenhagen the Franco-German axis is also seen as actually decisive as anywhere else. Interesting sort of tension here, because in Copenhagen, as in most other capitals, there's great sort of worries about what would happen if Marine Le Pen won. Also what would happen if Angela Merkel didn't win. Now she has won, or kind of won, and Macron has won. And you got a German axis, German axis, which in principle would be working. Then there are worries about what that axis was create. So you see that you get the tension there between the worries about Europe let loose amongst intergovernmentalists, and the worries about what happens when it's not. So and Denmark finds itself sort of caught between Scylla and Charybdis there, between the two sides. But yes.
Okay, thank you for very interesting presentations. I was wondering, my name is Marianne Rydvall, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the role of kind of external factors and countries in this. I mean, because there seems to be that Brexit is taking place alongside many other changes and crises going on, including, of course, a more aggressive Russia, and also a US president with what should you say, a different view on international cooperation than those typically held by Sweden and Denmark. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you see the role of the United States here. I mean, how you think Brexit will affect EU-US relations in a sense from your perspective, and how the positions and policies of the US then kind of are taken into consideration in this whole thing with the Denmark and the US and Sweden repositioning themselves in the EU. And also you mentioned this, but when it comes to security and defense, maybe you can expand a bit more about EU-NATO relations in light of then Brexit and other issues.
Thank you. Who would like to go first? Start with Björn again. Yep.
Let's start. Yeah, well, it's a good question, and well, as I see it, is to some extent it's all part of the same larger trend of kind of fragmentation of order, which we see globally, and with order I mean the kind of liberal world order, and we see it in Europe, and I think President Trump's disinterest in European affairs and especially European integration and commitments is one such example. Brexit is another. It's not an illiberal act in itself, but it is to its effect. It is still a UK leaving the largest free trade area that they could be part of, and it's also they're leaving an institution that embodies some of the norms and principles of this liberal world order, which it is a product of. And third, we have an illiberal trend in many European societies, looking at Hungary, Poland example, but also in other societies, in Sweden as well. And I think all of these three kind of illiberal tendencies affect each other in different ways. But I would say that the US effect, the kind of Trump factor, is more important. And for example, Brexit will have lots of geopolitical consequences if you only look at the UK and the EU and NATO, and you can imagine several effects. But if you zoom out, so you get the US in the picture, then the kind of Brexit effect disappears. It's not really important anymore, because if we really have a dire scenario where a future, even maybe Trump gets a second turn, or we'll have a new Trump after Trump, essentially Trump is not the problem. He's the symptom of a US disinterest in liberal order. They don't want to be part of it, they don't want to pay for it, they don't want to live in it. Well, then we have a large problem, and it doesn't really matter what the UK does. So Brexit doesn't really matter. On the other hand, if we'll have, I don't know, Michelle Obama in the White House in a couple of years' time, and she wants again to have a very constructive relationship with the EU, then the UK can't really afford to be a spoiler of European affairs. They would have to get on board again in some way or another as a constructive partner. So the Brexit effect kind of disappears in that scenario as well. So as long as you look at the US, if you bring the US into the picture, the big effects of Brexit disappears, I would argue. The other thing with the liberal societies in Europe, of course, also, especially when it comes to strategies, how to reposition itself. We talked about finding new allies. Well, one of the initial strategies of Sweden would have been to ally with countries like Poland and Hungary to get better partners outside, so we can have influence over the Euro countries. Well, that's not very tempting today. So again, we're staying close to Germany and the Nordics and the Dutch, for example. So yeah, there are great kind of interrelated effects among these factors.
Thanks very much. And I again thought that Björn's answer on the general issues was very exhaustive. I just want to add that yes, we're facing an illiberal moment. We certainly are, but the U.S. say descent from power could also have been managed a different way, and other political actors may also have done that. And you say Trump 1, Trump 2, but there are political differences here. I think that decline of power will have been managed differently with Hillary Clinton. So anyway, it's not a given. Now, more specifically on the consequences, quite interesting. I mean, most European countries, I think, were horrified by Trump. I think the German position was the most outspoken. Now, the Danes the Danish governments who have been following the Americans very closely in their security policies for a great number of years, and increasingly so, were amongst the least critical, and said that yes, there's a new president in the White House, but Danish-American relations do, of course, go beyond presidents. So we'll listen to what the Americans have to say and act accordingly, which I think is quite a different sort of strike of tone than you find many other countries. The Danish Prime Minister was also one of the very first ones to visit Trump, which sort of underlines again the feeling that this relation is important. And Denmark spends very little on defense, closer to 1% than to 2%, a lot closer to 1%. But one significant consequence of the Trump development is that for the first time for 25 years, Danish defense expenditures are going up. Not significantly, but with clear reference to what's happening in Washington, to pay attention to the needs of the alliance. So in that sense, yes, the liberal moment and the different versions on each side of the Atlantic certainly make for a split, but Copenhagen will go a long, long way to bridge that split and take part in options wherever that's necessary. I mean, a good colleague of mine has spoken about the Danish two-port doctrine. Have you heard about that? It's where the Danish cartoonist Storm Petersen has a cartoon where these two bohemian characters sitting on a bench, and one asks the other, when is the tuborg, which is a beer, a good thing to drink? Anytime, the other one says. And it's a bit the same with the military options. When is it a good idea to take part in U.S. military options? Well, anytime. And you would expect that to be the case as well from what we heard so far.
That is very interesting. What you just said also demonstrates, I think, also the differences between the Swedish and the Danish perspective traditionally in the European context, precisely because of the historical backdrop. We have a lot of questions on the list. I was wondering if we should now start to group them two and two together, so that you will get you can take notes, and then you can choose a bit where you want to put your emphasis. So the first question is here.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad, and I have a question to Mr. Fagersten. It's about Sweden's security political, let's say, alignment, rather, or the way you described the development during the past few years, past couple of years. The way I perceived it, anyway, is as a slight drift from a let's say you're inside the EU and you're following the developments concerning the defense or security political cooperation, but rather stressing the civilian aspects. Whereas now you are, let's say, more loyal or more supportive of the PESCO initiative, and at the same time you're aligning yourselves with the German initiatives within that broader perspective. Now my question is rather, and that is on the backdrop of the traditional cooperations you have had with the United States first and foremost, but also the initiatives that Sweden has made together with the other Nordic countries. That was about 11 years ago for a strengthening of the defense cooperation, defense procurement, military hardware, etc. Do you now see, after Brexit, a fresh impetus in direction of renewed or strengthened cooperation, both with the Nordic countries and with the United States? Thank you.
Take one more.
Thank you, Thierry Béchet, European Union in Oslo. Perhaps something on Nordic cooperation again. One of the many ways Norway has to be somehow half inside, half outside the EU is through Nordic cooperation. Informal meetings before the formal councils, using in a way, or using is not in a negative sense, but in trying to influence EU positions through the three other Nordic members. At the same time, you see in Brussels, or people say you see in Brussels, a temptation in the institutions to try to sharpen the distinction between ins and outs. And this can be this can have a negative impact, of course, on Norway. I think it's a temptation for the moment. To be honest, I don't see practical manifestations of that, but it is a danger, I think, for Norway. So my question is on the future of Nordic cooperation, on the future of how Norway could use more the Nordic cooperation and the extent to which the other three EU members in the Nordic cooperation would be ready, happy to play that game.
That is a good question, maybe difficult to answer, but we will let you try to respond. Henrik, would you like to go first?
Do you want to go first? Because there was a question specifically for you, or do you want to sort of have time to point?
Yes, well, on Swedish security policy and drifts, I think what you very effectively described is the two different policies that Sweden has at the same time, which is the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs strategy. The Ministry of Defense under Hultqvist has for some years now pressed for a strong bilateral relationship, predominantly with the US, but also with the UK. And of course, it was created under the Obama years, and there was a bit of a backfire when Trump came, but we still stand by this strategy, the Hultqvist doctrine, which is essentially bilateralism. And it's interesting how the perspective from within at least part of social democracy in Sweden has changed. I mean, before we didn't want to be in NATO because essentially of the US. It was an imperialist project. Now we can't really be in NATO because we want a much faster relationship and stronger with the US. So we don't need that bureaucracy in Brussels. We need a direct line to Washington. So important is the relationship to the US. So that's a bit of a 180 change, so you can stand still at the same position. And at the same time, we have a foreign minister who is interested in the EU, but not in military affairs. And then, of course, a defense minister who's interested in military affairs, but not at all in the EU. And I think that explains a little bit of the kind of different Swedish strategies. And there's no one really interested in EU military cooperation. But then again, then we have the German factor, so we kind of pulled into this. And I think, yes, the last year we've seen much more interest in these issues. I mean, if it's more likely that we will join NATO than we will join the Euro area, for example. It's about, I think, 40% in favor of NATO membership and only 13 or something for Euro membership. Probably neither of it will happen, at least in the coming, for the next government. But still, I mean, there's been a big change in the last years when it comes to Swedish policy. And I think just to take back, you brought up France and the 427, the solidarity, the mutual defense clause of the EU. That's something that Sweden takes pretty seriously. I mean, we even have our own solidarity doctrine, which we reproduce all the time, where we say that we will come to the help of others. We don't specify that it's military help, but still it's a solidarity doctrine. And of course, because of this, and because we're not in NATO, we have quite a lot to lose from Brexit, because the EU framework and the solidarity doctrines within the EU is the only link we have to the UK when it comes to security. Other members have NATO for that, but we don't. So we will lose a lot in our solidarity thinking when the UK leaves the EU. So that will be an interest from a Swedish perspective to try to replicate something that will be, according to us, that should be part of a future UK EU deal to replicate this kind of solidarity doctrine of some sort. But it's mostly in our interest, of course. Yes, I think I'll leave over to you for the Nordics.
Could I just ask you a quick follow-up question? Because we mentioned Finland earlier as another EU insider, but at the same time with similar sort of defense concerns as the Swedish ones. And I was wondering if you could just say a few words about how the bilateral Finnish-Swedish cooperation, if there's any sort of sign of an increase in that. I think there is, isn't there?
Yes, it's increasing all the time. It's increasing up to a level when we have an alliance among the non-aligned. It's a bit of an oxymoron. And now we prepare for cooperation also in times of non-peace, as we call it. So it's pretty close to an alliance. And I think this is, it's a convenient way for us to kind of increase cooperation and build up more capacity without, changing our overall security policy of military non-alignment. And I think Sweden would like, we talked about Norway and to bring it in, we would like to see more cooperation there as well. But there we have the NATO, well, the institutional differences, and I'm not sure how interested actually Norway and Denmark is to reproduce more cooperation on the Nordic level when it comes to military cooperation, without kind of risking your NATO obligations. But from a Swedish perspective, I think we're ready to go pretty far, as we've shown in the case of Finland.
That leaves the Nordic question for you, Henrik, and I think maybe that's fitting also, because sometimes when we speak about Nordic cooperation, we sometimes tend to think of the Danes as maybe the most continentally anchored and perhaps the least sort of country promoting Nordic cooperation as such. Maybe you could give some nuances to that.
Nuances there are many of, but I don't know if any of you come across the article by Alison Bales in the latest issue of Danish Year of Foreign Affairs. Quite an interesting one on the sort of emphasis of different countries, Denmark in particular, on Nordic cooperation. So I won't give very many nuances to that, but one nuance might be that I think that it's a Danish president of Nordefco, I think, or just used to be, and he actually wished for there to be more participation from all countries, Denmark inclusive. So that's obviously some leeway here. Now, let me just say something very general on Nordic cooperation. It may be the case that Denmark, but I think many other Nordic countries think that Nordic cooperation is both too big and too small. Too big in that, there are too many views, as the discussion today has shown, too many views for there to be a common front. And hence, too small to make the trouble to try to knock those heads together and get a common front is really worthwhile. And I think that might be one of the reasons why you got the level that you got now. But going much further than that would need a substantial change of political ambience. Again, I don't detect that in Copenhagen at the present moment or in time. It's about hanging on to the EU. It's about creating new allies within the EU. Having said that, Nordic cooperation continues, and it's obvious. It's almost so natural that it's not worth mentioning. But actually expanding it institutionally in other ways, I don't see any signs of it.
Okay, we have more questions on our list. The next question is here.
Thank you. Caroline de Guiter. I have a question about internal policies concerning the EU. I am Dutch myself, and I can tell you that Brexit is a huge trauma for the Dutch Prime Minister. I mean, we are in a different position, of course, because we are in the heart of everything. We have the euro, blah, blah, everything. But the trauma consists of the fact that the Prime Minister realizes that this could happen any day in the Netherlands. If you don't educate your people about what the EU is or what even the basic functions are, then, you know, and you piss on Brussels for like 40 years in a row, all the ministers do that, don't be surprised that the people vote like that. So what you see now in the Netherlands, and I'm really curious to hear if this is also happening in Denmark and Sweden, is that they're starting to talk, ministers are starting to talk a little bit differently about what they're doing in Brussels, what the EU is for. All of a sudden, our Minister of Foreign Affairs is not referring to Europe as simply a market. That's what I grew up with. You know, it was good for Philips and Unilever and basta. Now they're talking about never again, about plus jamais ça. You know, it's a community of values. That kind. I mean, it's very little, but I've never heard that before. And when you talk to people in the ministries, they say this is a very conscious, slow but conscious move. Does this happen in your countries too? Thank you.
We'll take one more question at the back there.
So I'm Arne Melchior, NUPI. So my question is about whether the UK could engage in some kind of regulatory cooperation with the EU after Brexit. So because there are many gloomy stories now about the UK losing from higher trade costs, and maybe investment will not go to Britain anymore for selling to the EU. But there is also the possibility that the UK may engage in kind of regulatory competition, for example, by lower taxes, etc. So is this a fair in the EU, and how will the EU kind of address it in the Brexit negotiations? Will you require agreements on taxation or broader issues? So could we have a kind of Singapore upon Thames, as some people put it? Is that a kind of fair in the EU?
Okay, two good questions. Anders, Hedrick, would you like to go first?
I'll go first. Well, first about the debate compared with the debate in the Netherlands, and it's quite interesting that you say that the new element in the debate in the Netherlands is an increasing emphasis on values, as I hear you, and there what you got in the Danish case is actually just the opposite. You got an increasing emphasis on the practicalities, and that's seen as a way to bringing people along with the project. So you never hear anything about institutional changes, as I mentioned before. Immigration has to be tackled, employment, cooperation on security, that sort of thing. That's seen as a way forward. The government has also initiated a lot of public consultations in that area, in lots of schools all over the country, where the government wants to hear what the people has to say. I'm not quite sure how it's going to summarize those consultations. I'm not very happy that it's not me who's going to do it. So there's a kind of concerted effort here to address the issue of popular discontent, alienation vis-a-vis the process. That's the first thing. The thing about avoiding the Singapore of Europe, I mean, I think all countries are very aware. If you look at the guidelines for the EU's negotiations with the UK about the future relationship of the 23rd of March, then you'll see there's a paragraph which the Danes think they've had a lot of influence on, which says that the EU wants to assure a level playing field. That means that it isn't just a question of getting a particular deal with the EU about market access, but it's also the case of the EU being so close geographically, so that if the EU has different policies, the UK has different policies, say on the environment or on labour legislation, that will of course indirectly affect the European country, the EU countries' possibilities for exporting to the British market and vice versa. So you actually got a sort of interest in the UK of the EU in that field that's much stronger than I would have thought a few months ago. The EU is actually going in and trying to dictate things that will not be directly related to the relationship EU-UK.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was a very good question. And it made me think. But I think the answer from Sweden is pretty similar to Denmark. That I think we have the same process of politicians actually trying harder to kind of sell the European project, but we still do that in in a pretty kind of transactional way. I mean, look at the Euro roaming costs or the free ticket for trains if you're 18, etc. So that's still the kind of selling point from a Swedish perspective. If it would work with values and never again, etc., they would try that as well, but it wouldn't really work on a Swedish political market. But the thinking behind it is the same. What I would say is also a change is actually a more substantive discussion about what kind of Europe we should have. I mean, this kind of transactional history of Swedish engagement meant that we always asked ourselves, like, is it still in our interest or not? So we kind of remain in our yes and no question to European affairs. We were kind of redoing our 1994 vote again and again and again mentally in any kind of European debate. And we did it in 2003 when it was about the euro. And I think maybe Brexit has allowed us to have a slightly more substantive and even philosophical question about what kind of Europe we should have, and not only should Sweden be part of it, yes or no. And so that's very helpful. It's also interesting for me as a political scientist, but I think it's generally a good development thanks to Brexit. But it also, I mean, it's interesting with Netherlands, which is also pinpointed as a country that we should cooperate more with, and a country that should kind of be drawn out of the Benelux group and be made Nordic. No, you say, but and when on regulatory affairs, I mean, we've asked the Brits many times this, is like, should we fear this? And their story, which I think is actually quite credible, is that just look at our trade flows. No one has more to lose from a kind of a trade war or regulatory fighting between the EU and the UK than the UK. So it would be foolish of them to try any kind of strategy that would just create discomfort among the EU 27. So I actually do not think that's a very likely scenario. Yeah. But that is based on the idea that they follow their self-interest, and then we wouldn't really be in the Brexit situation in the first place. So who knows? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nina Greger at NUPI. I guess I want to go back to some of the comments that you both had, and also to Henrik's last comment about what kind of, or who you choose as your main partner and ally. I mean, it seems to me from what you have said that both Denmark and Sweden are actually choosing allies according to policy area. I mean, where you can make a difference as a country, where you have particular interests, you seek for the key player, right? So that can change. That makes it also very difficult and complicated. But of course, that is not typical for your countries only. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that. I have three things. The second one is about the Nordics. I tend to disagree with you, Björn, on your sort of image of the Nordics. You said we're all free farmers, but once you scratch on the surface, you see that we're so different. Well, I think that depends on from where you look. I mean, we have non-aligned and aligned, like NATO member states in that. But, I mean, Sweden and also to some extent Finland have really, really close relations with NATO. Norway has very close relations with the EU. We are almost a sort of an economic member. If you look at the UN, we have so many things in common. We have the UN caucus. If you look at our populist parties on the rise. So, I mean, there are many, many things that are similar. Doesn't mean that we always agree and have chosen the same path. But I think you should sort of modify that a bit. Maybe you just want to be funny, I don't know. Anyway, the third thing, and maybe most importantly, I think, is that, of course, I agree with you that both Brexit and the election of Trump are symptoms of something. I mean, currents that have been there for quite some time. The UK has always been very sort of anti, or at least anti-EU sentiments. And of course, although Obama was someone we liked, I don't know how interested he really was in Europe. But of course, he's much better than the one we have now. So I guess the question for researchers would be, why now? Why exactly now? Because we see it all coming. We were seeing it all coming. I guess that was more comments than questions. Sorry.
Thank you. I have no one else on my list at the moment, and we're getting closer to the end of the seminar. But I would like to add one more question for you as well, because I think, and Björn, you have written about this previously, how Brexit in some respects served as a proxy almost for a national debate in Sweden about membership, about what kind of relations one should have with the European integration process. And I think there are similar trends to be observed also in Denmark, and certainly here in Norway also, where Brexit has been used as a catalyst almost to discuss things that haven't been part of the debate for some time. Now, you both also mentioned how the elections of Macron and of Merkel were outcomes that sort of changed, or at least made changes perhaps less necessary in terms of how one oriented oneself in relations to Europe. But I was wondering also in the connection of the Brexit debate, how the order is quite fragile if you think about how those two elections could have turned out quite differently. And I was wondering what kind of outcomes you envision that could alter the national debates in Sweden and Denmark. You mentioned how there's a stable majority supporting the current status. It's very similar as in Norway, where there's also support for the current status. But what do you think? What kind of scenario do you envision that could sort of lead to more profound debates about the association with the EU in your countries?
Right. Let me start with the last one first. I mean, yeah. I mean, this is a brilliant question, and I think again one has to think about the situation on the eve of the French elections, on the French presidential elections, and on the eve of the general elections, and how politicians in many countries were worried. And that, of course, has something to do with how this is not just a question of reacting to particular outcomes. It's something about the foundations of the political debates and the political views and discourses and the rest of it. So, yeah, in a situation where Le Pen had won, and it would have been very difficult for Germany to engage with her, although she moderated her views. That, I think, would certainly have created a very substantial debate about basic views and basic orientations. And I would go as far as actually hesitating to give any kind of answer here, because here we're dealing with the fundamentals. So you're right, the order is very fragile and will continue to be very fragile in the years to come. So the kind of, when I'm sort of basing my feet sort of firmly in the blue air by saying that those discourses, then yes, at the moment. Now, Nina had a very sort of a good point about how policy stances are actually related to choices of partners are related to choices of particular policy areas. And I think you've got a very good point here. And for all that I've said about how Denmark is seeking partners now, then one should not think that the foreign services and the governments are thinking so long term that they're actually thinking past Brexit, because that's a long, long time away. They are talking short term, and it's as one of the people I've spoken to in the Foreign Service said, it's a question of keeping the kettle brewing rather than anything specific. So I think that's very important. One shouldn't read too much into those bilateral efforts. They are policy related, and you've got to get closer to the finishing line. That is 2019 or actually 2021 before that really starts to kick in. Yeah, why Trump? Well, complicated question, but I think it's correct that generally speaking, the EU is in decline, if for no other reason, because lots of other actors are getting stronger. So the US just can't manage the kind of efforts it's making. So you would expect an American disengagement. That combined, of course, with the popular sentiment, create Trump. But you would expect disengagement whoever came to power in the long term. Trump is just speeding it up, or is he? We don't know, because it's quite unpredictable. But still, that's what it's looking like. But it's really who would manage that decline in what way? That's what it's about.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I mean, you have a very good point, Nina, with the if you shift focus, maybe the views of the Nordics is pretty different, and maybe we ourselves exaggerate our differences. There's I don't know if you follow the awful fate of the Swedish Academy right now. That's the institution, the highest ranking institution in Sweden, which picks the Nobel Literature Prize, and they're just falling apart because of the Me Too issues and the sexual harassments by a male, which resulted today actually with the Academy kicking out all the women from this academy. And it's not really in the self-image of Sweden to have this development. The New York Times wrote about it this morning, but funnily enough, The Guardian wrote an article describing all this farce, ending with the paragraph like the Swedish Academy is under direct patronage of the Norwegian king. Which was the only funny thing coming out from this story, we think. But maybe it says something about that other countries might not see our differences as clear as we do ourselves. That about that. On your question about, I can only agree, and I think on fragility, I mean, we have an election coming up in September, and it's very difficult to see a kind of a stable. I mean, we don't really do stable majority systems anyway. We've tried minority governments for quite some time, and it works okay. But it's going to be even more of a minority government, most likely, after September. It might even be a grand coalition between if they can gather enough support, and that, of course, will just feed into the kind of the idea of the populist and in Sweden the Sweden Democrats, if we will try this grand coalition tactic, so then we'll just kind of pushing the problem in front of us. So I'm pretty. The other alternative, we might have a conservative government running on their own as a minority government with about 20 to 25% support, with passive support from different directions, and that will also be a pretty weak and fragile government. So I'm pretty pessimistic when it comes to stability, but I don't think it will change the overall kind of if we're talking foreign and security policy, European engagement. It would again take another serious banking crisis for us to consider the euro. The NATO issue is differently. It moves slowly all the time, and we only need Russia continue to doing what Russia is doing, and then we will have a support, I think, for NATO membership within a couple of years. But the euro is different.
Okay, could you all join me in giving a big applause to our two speakers? We tend to think that we know quite a bit about Sweden and Denmark, but I think it's always interesting to have colleagues from Sweden and Denmark coming here and talking about current affairs in their countries. I would also like to thank the audience for engaging questions and for sitting here on a Friday afternoon and being part of a discussion on the EU affairs. We have more seminars coming up at NUPI. There's a seminar in the Europe series next week with Caroline Reuters at the front here. And we very much look forward to that. So please pay attention to our website and have a good weekend and good Friday. Thank you all.